Welcome to the Next Generation Dog Podcast, hosted by Melinda Benbow of Urban Uplander Pet Care and Bethany Carter of Sanguine Moon Kennels. Join Melinda and Bethany as they discuss dog breeds, sports, training, health, and much more with special guests. Tune in weekly for all things dedicated to dogs.
Well, thank you all for tuning in to another episode of the Next Generation Dog Podcast. I'm Melinda with my other host, Bethany.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to meet you all today. I'm really excited to have our guest on, and I just can't wait to hear more.
Awesome. Well, Bethany, you are cutting out a little bit for me, so just want to go ahead and mention that. So if you do have any issues further in the episode, I will let you know. But like Bethany said, we do have an awesome guest with us today. This is Selena Johnson. Selena is here today because I, and I believe Bethany as well, are interested in doing CGC, which is Canine Good Citizen. And we have a number of questions about just what it is, how to get started, and how we can make the most of this test and title. So Selena is here to give us the rundown. And before we get started, Selena, can you go ahead and introduce yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, definitely. I'm a dog trainer who's based out of Pittsburgh, PA. And I specialize in psychiatric service dogs. So service dogs for things like anxiety, PTSD, autism, and pet dogs in general. I live with my 4-year-old German Shepherd. Her name is Fee, and 2 cockatiels. I am a certified dog trainer. So I have a certification through CPDT. And I also am a family dog mediator, which is a certification run through Kim Brophy. And also I've been working with animals for about 5 years, off and on, just like all sorts of animals, volunteering at shelters and things like that. But I've really been doing my deep dive into training for about 3. And really I started off with pet dogs mostly. I wanted to dive into service dogs mostly because there's a lack of resources here in Pennsylvania where I live. And I kind of wanted to help fill in that gap. And because I would have found that useful for myself if I also had a resource like that.
I love that. I think that's why a lot of us get into the pet community and the pet jobs is we always think about, what do we want for our dogs? You know, that's definitely what got me into boarding was, hey, I think I want to keep my dog at home and there's a lack of this. So let's create it. You did mention, and I have to touch on this, what other animals have you worked with besides dogs and your cockatiels?
Oh yeah. So I've also, I have a pretty wild background. My parents own a farm, and basically it was my job to take care of the farm animals. So I have worked with donkeys, pigs, and chickens. For the donkeys, pretty much I had to train them to walk nicely on a halter and a lead. So kind of like loose leash walking. And then I've also owned a ferret who I taught to do several different kinds of tricks like roll over, stand up, things like that. And I also recently participated in my local chicken camp where I went out to a farm and we trained the farm animals and I was assigned a chicken. So we taught chickens to target.
What was your favorite species to work with?
I think the emus were really interesting. They really scared me though. They don't peck as hard as the chickens, even though they're much larger.
Oh, that's interesting. That's so crazy. I know you mentioned donkeys, and I love donkeys. They're my absolute favorite animal. So I definitely got so excited when I saw that. But emus, that's absolutely nuts. So let's jump right into it. Bethany and we've been talking about this for the past year. You know, we go back and forth is this the time we're going to sign up for CGC? And we're still working on this and that. So can you go ahead and give us an idea of what CGC is and the levels of CGC?
Yeah, definitely. So the AKC, Canine Good Citizen, which is abbreviated to CGC, is basically a title that any dog can get. I believe you don't even have to have your dog registered under AKC to get the CGC, which is really neat. You can still get the certificate without enrolling your dog into the purebred alternative listing or in the canine partners listing. And basically what it is, it's a test that basically goes over what it means to be a good citizen. So it covers things like loose leash walking, sit, stay, some basic obedience, being able to leave your dog with a trusted stranger and leaving the room for 3 minutes. It's really not difficult, but it's also difficult at the same time. It's not something where, you know, if you were to record this as for your own, you know, just to show off, most people aren't going to go, wow, that's so amazing. But at the same time, it's really difficult, especially for pet dog owners who have never trained a dog for any sort of test. It's a lot of pressure on both the dog and the people.
Absolutely.
But it's kind of weird. And I'll go over the different kinds of levels. So the very first level we have is the AKC Star Puppy. And Star Puppy is kind of dipping your toes into the Canine Good Citizen. It requires you to take a 6-week class, and it is the only CGC level that requires you to take a class. And it goes over things like, does your dog have identification? Do you have poop bags for your dog? Do you play with your dog and exercise your dog? Those are questions that I have to ask my puppy people. They have to be able to loose leash walk for at least 5 feet. They have to do a down and a sit with a food lure. And even though these things seem really easy, it's just kind of dipping your toes into this title and getting people excited to train their dog. It is limited to dogs who are under a year old, though. So unfortunately for older dogs, if you adopted an older dog, you can't take Star Puppy. You kind of have to dive straight into CGC or, you know, take some basic obedience classes before you move into CGC. The AKC CGC itself has no minimum age requirement, though, which I find really interesting. The age requirement is actually dictated by whoever the evaluator is. So whenever there is a dog show, for example, sometimes they do Canine Good Citizen testing, their minimum is a year sometimes, because that's just what they set. Other times, therapy dog organizations will hold CGC testing, and for them, it could be as high as 2 years old. But I think on average, from what I've seen, most dogs do pass around 1 to 2 years old. It's very rare to find a dog who passes really early, like 6 months, but it does happen.
Okay.
That gives us some realistic views. I think it's very important to really focus on maybe not stretching the dog too thin.
Yeah, and for example, in my service dog program that I do, I actually require people to get their CGC before we even move on to any service dog stuff, because a lot of times people want to rush through things. They want to get this done. They're like, it has to get done. My dog is going to be a failure if I don't get this done by 1 year. And it's just my way of saying, please slow down. It's okay.
Yeah.
There is time. And like, you can always take the test. You can always take the test early. It's actually also a good goalpost too, because for a lot of people, I'm one of these people. If I don't have a goalpost, I'm kind of like, what the heck am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to train?
That's me 100%. Absolutely. I have to have those dates and those big things to push towards, you know, it just helps. But I think you're right. On a trainer level, I think CGC, starting out for a service dog program, is a great way to also maybe see who's a serious candidate and is willing to do the beginning steps to get there. And, you know, I think we briefly talked earlier about, I've worked for a place that did training for CGC. And one thing the evaluator mentioned a lot is she noticed that a lot of the dogs under 2 years old had a really hard time actually getting passing scores. Could that just be dependent on the evaluator, or is that something that you do think maybe it takes a little bit more time, and we should not put those numbers on our dogs and really just work to their pace?
I think it's a mix of everything. So I do think that at least for like a Canine Good Citizen class, some evaluators do make it way more difficult than they need to. Recently, I attended a CGC class, or not even a class, just a test. and I was watching them conduct this test. And one of the test items is walking by a dog and a person calmly from a distance of, I believe it's 8 feet. So there's a pretty big distance. But this evaluator had 4 or 5 people walking around with their dogs, and we were expected to walk through this. And that was just, it was way, way, way too hard for what a CGC should be. Another thing is that different breeds are going to pass at different times. Something that a breed that is very biddable and very, very into their handler, like a golden retriever, might pass at 8 months. But a livestock guardian breed like a Pyrenees might not pass until 2. So I think it's just like this combination of everything. But I also think that we really shouldn't stress that, like, okay, if your dog can't pass at 1 year old, that means you failed. Because I don't think that's realistic either.
Absolutely not. I think a lot of people, we do set these moving goalposts for our dogs a lot, and it's something to where we do have to say, puppyhood does happen for a while. For a lot of breeds, 3 years, you're still going to see those puppy-like behaviors, and I've been a victim of it by mentally putting too much on my dog, just thinking, I want to have these goals accomplished by these particular times, and if we don't, that we have failed. But it's really not the case at all. It just means we're putting way too much pressure on ourselves and our dogs. But while we talk about pressure and criteria, can you tell us a little bit more about what the stages of CGC are? I know you mentioned passing by somebody at a particular distance and handing them off. Can you run through a little bit more of that and the criteria of each of those?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. I also want to go talk about the other 2 levels.
Yeah, please.
That was my question. I'm really concerned about urban setting. Especially with my wild bird dogs. Definitely want to find more ways to work towards that. So I'm really interested in what you have to say. What information do you have for us?
Yeah, so the Canine Good Citizen Advanced basically is the second part of the Canine Good Citizen. Most people do not go ahead and get the advanced title. In fact,
didn't even realize it was a thing, honestly.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to find somebody who wants to evaluate for that. It actually requires a witness, unlike Canine Good Citizen. And the test items are a lot harder. So when I start talking about the test items, you'll see the difference. And then Canine Good Citizen Urban is kind of a misnomer. I think it really should be called Canine Good Citizen Public versus Urban, because it doesn't need to take place in like a city environment. It just needs to take place sort of like out in the wild, like I like to say, and not in a facility-like setting. And the Canine Good Citizen Urban is actually, I think it's actually easier than the normal Canine Good Citizen. It's just harder to get because, again, not many people want to leave their facilities, and also like not many people want to offer it as a service.
Interesting.
But let's see. So let's talk about the Canine Good Citizen test items. The first test item is accepting a friendly stranger. And basically what this means is that the instructor would go up to a dog, stand about 4 or 5 feet apart, and air shake. This used to be that you would shake hands with the person who's testing, but because of COVID, they actually changed that. So we don't do hands touching anymore. Okay. And the dog should, be calm, collected, and not shy away or be reactive or aggressive. So we're just basically looking for neutrality in the dog. And for the second one, we have sitting politely for petting. Now, sitting politely for petting is one of those things where it depends on what evaluator you have. For example, when I ask for sitting politely for petting, I will ask the handler to put their dog into a sit, and I will ask them, would you like me to pet your dog's head or back? So I offer that choice because not every dog likes to be pet on their head. Now, I know recently I learned that the AKC obedience, or it might be UKC obedience, has this as a test item, but it specifies that you have to be able to touch the dog's head. But for Canine Good Citizen, they don't specify. And as long as the dog is not reactive, aggressive, or shying away, I consider it a pass. The next test item is appearance and grooming. So basically, is the dog well groomed? Do they have mats? Are they really excessively smelly? These are things, but as long as the dog is, fairly brushed out, they don't need to be super clean or like professionally groomed, but just, a pet dog.
Good condition.
In
Yeah.
general, good condition. They kind of pass that. The next test item is out for a walk, walking on a loose lead. Now, the difference between Star Puppy and the CGC in this one is Star Puppy specifically says 5 feet of loose lead walking. That's a really short distance.
Yeah.
For CGC, out on a walk is a lot longer. So when I've conducted this test in a variety of spaces, I've conducted it in a convention style location. I've conducted it at like Lowe's, and I've also conducted it in a facility. And basically what this means is that we're going to be walking, and occasionally I'm going to tell them to take a right, take a left, do an about turn, and do a stop. And this can be several feet. This can be like down an entire hallway. But generally, it should be in a pretty calm environment. So we're not asking for, a crazy convention center in the dog show, but we're just asking for a new-ish place that has maybe, some stuff where dogs have been.
Yeah.
But we're not asking for them to like walk through a New York City crowd.
Sure.
And then the walking through the crowd for the CGC version is that you need to be able to pass at least 3 people. The dog can look at the people, they can show general interest, but they shouldn't be pulling or lunging or barking. Just a nice loose leash walk. And they don't have to be in a tight heel. That's the thing I like to stress as well. The dog doesn't need to be in an obedience heel. They just need to be in a nice loose walk. So they can lag behind a little bit. They can be a little bit forward, just as long as, they're not straining at the end of their leash. For test item 6, we have sit and down on a cue and stay in place. So for this test, a lot of people like to teach sit, then a down. And you've probably seen this, but like a lot of dogs will be like, oh, I know what the next step is. I'm going to lay down now. Unfortunately, they can't do that. And this is the hardest thing for people to break. So if we ask them to sit, they can't lay down. Even though they're still in a stay, technically they can't do that.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so that's a really, really hard habit to break. And I try to give people alternatives to teaching down if their goal is Canine Good Citizen. Like I'm upfront with them from my beginning class, just saying, if this is your goal, try not to ask them to sit and then down if we can.
So what ways do you recommend doing that?
So I like to teach down in a couple different ways. One of the ways I like to do is I'll sit in a chair and I'll lower the dog underneath my legs. And they sort of have to do this army crawl to get to the tree underneath my legs. This also really helps with handlers who can't stand. So handlers that are in wheelchairs or just generally people who can't bend down. It's just a great way of teaching down without having to have a lot of physical movement for the person. And another way you can teach down is sort of you take a treat in your hand and you kind of push into them a little bit so they have to fold back down into a down. And that's sort of like, I think a lot of like bite work people like this version of down because it looks very clean when they do it.
It's definitely that Malinois type training. You see them kind of go into their down. I love that. And then so I definitely have a number of questions, but are there any other parts to the CGC or is that all of them?
So there's 4 more parts. There's coming when called. So the dog should be in a sit stay or a down stay. And basically you would walk 20 feet away from them and call them over. It's pretty self-explanatory. Sure. Test item 8 is a reaction to another dog. So there should be one other person with one other dog. They should be at a distance about 20 feet to start. They should walk past each other, but stop once they see each other. Pretend to shake hands. They don't need to be like right next to each other and actually shake hands, and then continue on. And so the dog should not jump, bark, lunge, anything like that. But the dog also shouldn't be in their face. And then we have reaction to distraction. Reaction to distraction can be pretty much anything that's distracting. I have had people push a cart. I've had people drop something heavy. I've had somebody run by as a jogger. Really, it's just anything that's like sudden and kind of very distracting. And the dog, again, shouldn't be aggressive, bark, lunge, panic, none of those things. And the last test item, which can be really easy for some dogs or really challenging, is supervised separation. And that's the part where you would hand off the leash to the trainer or a trusted stranger and basically go out of the way, be unseen for 3 minutes. And the dog shouldn't bark or whine or pace or be something that's like extreme, like showing a lot of anxiety, basically. Sure. And the evaluators, yeah, for a lot of people, it's difficult because it's hard to find a trusted stranger.
Yeah.
And as an evaluator, I can talk to the dog. I can say, hey, puppy, or like, good boy, anything like that. But I can't, like really overly comfort the dog.
Okay.
And another thing sorry. And another thing to note is that during the Canine Good Citizen, there is no treats allowed. There are no corrections allowed. But you're allowed to verbally praise your dog.
Oh my
God. I do like that.
Good to know. I mean, at least, we can give some kind of, a marker, some kind of verbal praise. It sounds like maybe physical praise, some pets here and there. But I know, Bethany, I'm sure in there you heard what the scary parts sound like to you. I know leaving my dog with somebody is something that, we've definitely practiced and tried, but it's very hard to continually introduce a new stranger. And by the time your dog gets comfortable, it's like, well, then that person's no longer a stranger, and we have to find the next person to work with. Do you have any recommendations on how I can continue to build on this? Is there anything you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I like to do is I like to introduce the behavior as just a stay, but with a person. So you can ask your dog to just do a sit, stay, down, stay, or just a plain old stay while the person holds their leash and then leave. And that can sometimes help a dog just realize, oh, you're not leaving me for this person. You're just leaving and you're going to be right back.
God, that's so smart.
So I like just teaching a dog that, like, okay, if I'm telling you to be with this person, it's just a temporary thing. So just letting your dog kind of know what the outcome is.
So I can shape a good stay into the duration and me disappearing for a little bit to pretty much be leaving her with a stranger, essentially.
Yep. And the stranger would just kind of be the same as if you were to hire to a host outside while you go get a coffee or something like that. Another thing I like to do is if you have people that you trust, so for example, I am constantly at my pet-friendly coffee shop. I am obsessed with coffee. People know me there. I know them. I've seen them. We've talked. And they're still pretty much strangers to my dogs. And I can say, hey, do you want to help me with some training? I'll buy you a cup of coffee or something like that. And you can enlist people who you're, on friendly terms with to kind of help you. I know nowadays after COVID, it's really hard to find pet store employees who are not busy since they're continuously understaffed. But if you have a pet store that you're super friendly with and they have a free moment, a lot of the times, they're happy to help as well.
They're willing to help. That's so smart. And again, I'm guessing you would recommend this, but I know like anything we would do, we would start with smaller durations and build our way up, especially when working with new people and new environments. I love that. I'm going to try all of that. That, again, leaving the dog with a trusted stranger is my biggest worry. Bethany, I'm sure you heard something in there that scares you. What are you thinking over there?
Yeah, so I shared that common feature there where, again, COVID babies picked her up as soon as COVID hit within I think it was 2 weeks. And we have had struggles of that separation anxiety and leaving her. So we're starting to learn and build those behaviors. But now she's coming up on 3. I've seen a lot of maturity in her anyways, just in growth in general. So I'm hoping that training will be a little bit easier once she's done whelping and we're practicing some behaviors here at home in between to keep her mentally stimulated. But I'm really excited to continue to probably listen to the same podcast over and over to make sure that really sticks in my head. Now, Selena, there was one thing that I did want to ask that we haven't covered yet, and I know we're coming close to time, so I want to try to fit it in. One thing we didn't cover was what is the appropriate attire for the dog for the CGC? Can they wear slip leads, harnesses, gentle leaders?
Yeah, so generally the consensus is that we are not going to wear any training equipment. Now, this is kind of debated between evaluators, and this is also kind of where I say it really depends on your evaluator, what your experience is going to be. The handbook for the Canine Good Citizen specifically says that a flat collar, a slip collar, and a back clip harness are okay. The slip collars kind of surprised me, but I believe they allow that because a lot of these tests are done at dog shows and the dogs are shown on slip collars. However, e-collars and prongs are not allowed and front clip harnesses are not allowed. I have had instructors, though, not even allow a martingale or a harness at all. So
you definitely have to pick your evaluator.
Yeah. For me, myself, I allow martingales, harnesses clipped to the back, and flat collars. Now, if somebody came with me to a slip collar and wanted to just take the test, I would allow them just because the CGC handbook explicitly says that's okay. But all of my classes, I do request that none of my students have adversives on their dogs. And if for some reason they feel like they need an aversive, we would work on them and privately until they felt like they were safe enough to take a group class without it.
I like that.
And another thing is that there's just no corrections allowed at all. No verbal corrections, no, leash checking, nothing like that is super important. And which is why I really, really believe that if you do take a Canine Good Citizen class, I really, really stress to find a trainer who is part of like KPA, CPDT, or IAABC, just because I feel like it sets you up for a little bit more success as a person when you have somebody who doesn't even include those in their like toolbox.
That's smart.
Thank you.
That's a really good question, Bethany. I did not think about that. And I'm definitely an Easy Walk user. So that's definitely something that I will. And I like how you said, well, pick your evaluator. And I'm like, well, I got to learn how to walk on a flat collar. So we kind of both got our own interpretation out of that. But I do agree. Pick your evaluators. It sounds like just like I did with you, Selena. It sounds like reach out ahead of time, really get to know these people, see what their criteria is and make sure that it matches, what you're doing with your dog. And ultimately, it sounds like maybe do some CGC classes. Even myself as a trainer, it sounds like it's not going to hurt to go experience another trainer's system and curriculum, and just to make sure we're set up for success. I do want to make sure that we hit everything that you think is important when it comes to CGC. Is there anything that we missed out on that you want to make sure listeners definitely understand?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I wanted to talk about is like why in the world you should take a CGC, or like
Absolutely.
Why that is a good goal. One of the things that I like about the CGC is that you get a ribbon and you get a certificate. and I love trinkets. I'm obsessed with trinkets.
Absolutely.
I'm there. You sold me.
Yeah, the more little things that I can have and hang on my walls, the better. They sell patches, they sell medals, they sell all sorts of fun little trinkets if you pass your Canine Good Citizen. Another thing is that some insurance companies will actually waive their dog fee, especially if you have what insurances call like a dangerous dog. So, your German Shepherds, your bully mixes, Rottweilers, things like that. And another thing is if you have an issue with, let's say, a condo board, a co-op, an HOA, a lot of the times all of this can be, wiped off the table if you have a Canine Good Citizen. It just is a third party saying, hey, this dog can behave, and I've seen this dog behave. And finally, not everybody, but, it can be worth it.
But something to know. Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing is that I know that service dog training, especially private service dog training, is a really big thing in the United States. It's a good goalpost to have for anybody who is looking to have a service dog and who is trying to train their own service dog. And it allows you to really break down your steps and your goals and really learn who your dog is, how they learn, how they want to be rewarded, and just generally just like learning about your dog. Because for a lot of people, when they get their puppy at 8 weeks, you're complete strangers. You have no idea who this dog is.
Yeah. I love that. And even for the basic pet owner, same thing, these are going to be the moments that you get to truly, and especially if you're listening to your dog, like you said, figuring out what actually motivates your dog, what your dog considers reinforcing, what your dog considers punishing. I think people forget that, punishment and rewards are dependent on the dog and what they consider punishing and rewarding. And these are just great bonding moments to keep doing. I know Bethany and I love dock diving and, field stuff, and we do a lot of things, but these CGC and what we'll talk about in our next episode, trick titles, are just great ways to add more bonding moments for our dogs. So I'm so happy you got to join us, Selena. Again, this is Selena Johnson. She is going to be my evaluator when it comes to trick dog here soon. I'm going to have to find somebody who compares to you here for CGC. But before we go, can you go ahead and let our listeners know where they can find you on social media or on the internet?
Yeah, definitely. So I have a TikTok and an Instagram. I am admittedly way more active on Instagram than I am on TikTok. It's phenomenal.canine. And I also have a website. It's phenomenalcanine.com. I work virtually as well. So I do virtual appointments, especially for my service dog people, since a lot of people live in areas without service dog trainers. But I am based in Pittsburgh, PA. So if you're ever in the area, I'm more than happy to come and meet your dog.
I love that. We may have to travel that for our CGC. It sounds like
you
thank
should.
You again. I think we might. We may have to. So thank you for joining in. And as always, thank you, Bethany. Don't forget to check us out on social media and stay tuned for our next episode with Selena.
Thank you, Selena.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Next Generation Dog Podcast. Weekly episodes are released on Fridays on Spotify and YouTube. Please follow the Next Gen Dog Pod on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Facebook for even more content dedicated to all things dogs. Follow Urban Uplander Pet Care and Sanguine Moon Kennels on Instagram and Facebook.